presentation on all 6 of the proposals that fit into this theme, and then we'll open it up for questions about whichever ones you have questions about. So we're not going to work through them in order other than presenting them. And so if the following folks are in the room, if you want to come up, Heather, Barbara Lynn, Ross, Aaron and Brian, and Fred. I think you know you're doing this. But before we begin, I'd like to invite us into a moment of prayer. Holy One, with our hearts open and our ears wide, we come, listening for your Spirit to move in these conversations, finding ways to be clear about what is before us, finding a way forward, for you always call us to move forward, to move with your Spirit, to move with each other, to help another along the side, bringing them along, but holding on to the importance of questions and questioning, knowing that our hearts belong to you. In that spirit we pray. Amen. So, Heather Leffler, Hamilton 01, and Hamilton 01 and BQ 01 are very similar, so I think we're talking about them together. Is that, yeah, come on up.
Good afternoon. So when the comprehensive review suggested denominational council as our court, our national court or our denominational court, they were thinking that it was going to be very different, that representatives from each pastoral charge would be coming into that body, and it would be quite different. When the 42nd General Council looked at it, we chose to leave the General Council in basically the same format that we have here now, where the regions would be sending representatives. And so it's the feeling in our conference that there are things that are very worthy of change, and there are changes that if we make, they're just going to make more work for everybody. And throughout the church, there aren't always common understandings. People now mostly understand General Council, so we're recommending that we maintain the term General Council for our national court.
Barbara Lynn Goodwin on ANW08, prioritizing clusters and networks.
Good afternoon. So I bring to you ANW8 about clusters and networks because I think that there is a true concern over the intent and that we need to have a prioritization of this in the denominational level in the formation of our clusters and networks. So there have been probably 4 or 5 documents that have mentioned clusters and networks. Fishing on the Other Side suggests that we want groups that gather together for worship, mutual support, faithful action, instead of governance. And we want to be able to build networks for mission, worship, partnership, justice, and staff enabling connections. United in God's Work suggests that clusters of communities should gather regularly for collegiality, support, learning, and that networks link people with common interests across the church. Comprehensive Review Task Force suggests that clusters and networks would not be formal government bodies, but they would be central to our living out of our faith. In particular, paying attention to the principle of the engagement of networks and clusters with the councils. I'm assuming the 3 councils. Study Guide Remit 1 suggests that clusters are local clusters of communities of faith that would provide community and support for the communities and their leaders, and focus on worship, mission, learning, collegiality, and strategic planning. Networks are defined as groups of people in different parts of the country working on specific issues or on a project. Now, I think that the crux of this, when I studied this and I got input from people who were involved in writing this proposal, the true crux of this is whether clusters and networks will be central to the living out of our faith, or are they more of an extra piece that regions can support or not, and that communities of faith can experiment with them or not. So the discrepancy is between how they were upheld in the consultation process and how they were treated by the General Council Executive during implementation. And so the suggestion is, the desired outcome is, that it's threefold. Firstly, that General Council 43 affirm that clusters and networks are central to living out our faith in the three-council model. Secondly, that to develop a strategy that prioritizes the formation of clusters and networks. And thirdly, to establish the expectation that each community of faith will engage in a period of experimentation, or perhaps join at least one cluster or network.
Ross Bartlett, Maritime 03, please.
Hi, this proposal tries to move forward a piece of business which was part of the 42nd General Council, but which, from the point of view of those in pastoral charges and in the wider church, has not perhaps received the impetus or the emphasis that it might have. When we eliminate the court of presbytery, there are four functions that need to go someplace else. The court of presbytery is responsible for oversight and discipline and collegiality and support. The office of vocation is taking over the majority of the responsibility, the functional responsibility for the first two. The Association of Ministers was to take over the responsibility for the latter two. And in the work of the 42nd General Council, the association was seen as being of as much importance as any of the other aspects. Unfortunately, during the triennium, it seems as if the work on the association has received a lower priority in terms of energy and time, and certainly in terms of publicity. You have to dig pretty deep in the records of the General Council Executive to find where some work has been done on the association. And this is by no means to say that that work was not hard work, it was not faithful work. Part of the problem is the lack of communication with ministry personnel who are stakeholders in this. The first that most of us heard of this process in the triennium was a survey that came out earlier this calendar year, which dealt with just a very few issues. Now, according to reports that appear in the General Council Executive, there is a task group. You have to go someplace else to find the names of the members. And that task group has met with various other organizations to talk about what an association might look like. No idea what those conversations have resulted in. And the working plan is that the task group will give a final report to PC MEPS, which will presumably include it in their final report to the General Council Executive in the fall. It doesn't even come here. And so this, because of the nature of the way the church will be structured now in terms of its dealing with ministry personnel, this proposal simply hopes to keep the emphasis on the association keep the pot boiling, so to speak, recognizing that if we do in fact implement Remit proposals, there's going to be a tremendous amount of work to be done. The appearance is that, and I say the appearance rather than the reality, the appearance is that this has already moved somewhere down the ladder of priority. We want to keep that priority there, to reaffirm that the association is something that is important to the General Council. This does not presume anything about the shape, function, funding of the association. That's still to be determined. But in our structure, the only group with the organization and the authority to move this kind of far-ranging conversation ahead is in fact the General Council and its executive, at least to get the conversation started to the point where it can be picked up by those who might be members of it.
Thank you very much. GCE19 assessment rate. Eric, are you talking about this one, or is Brian Cornelius in the room? Eric Matheson. I have both your names, so.
Good afternoon. GCE19 has a very long a preamble that describes some of the underlying budget assumptions and principles that have been articulated and developed over the last, well, in particular over the last 2 years, but accelerating more once we actually knew that the remits were being implemented. To be honest, from a financial modeling point of view, a lot of my thinking was in the Permanent Committee on Finance thinking, actually was contemplating that if the remits didn't pass, what would the financial modeling look like? So when they did, we just built from the original premise. In any case, the Remit 4 itself, which is the new funding model, which has now been ratified, contemplates a shift to a revenue-based model. The briefing materials that went with that remit talked about a 4.5% adjusted revenue basis for calculating the assessment. And there was a fair bit more detail in that, but that number was arrived at looking at a couple of different factors. One, the amount of money that it was hoped we could run the church on with some significant, painful ongoing cost reduction, and also what communities of faith or congregations or pastoral charges were already paying. So that number that was arrived at was 4.5%. And the overriding principle was out of revenue that wasn't raised for an outward purpose. So money's raised for mission and service, money's raised for revenues for refugee sponsorships, the local food bank, whatever it might be, all of those would be subtracted out. In the consent agenda, we also learned that including the capital campaign revenues might be challenging. Initially, we thought that it would make sense to normal fundraising might include some building fund contributions, for example, and we thought we might be able to distinguish between that and a larger capital campaign. Ultimately, we concluded that that would be perhaps too difficult an element to break down, and we also had a proposal come forward that made that same argument, which is why you found it in the consent agenda. Bottom line, the proposal talks about what the General Council could endorse or approve and also help set a direction for the next few years. So specifically, the how might the General Council respond to the issue? You're being asked here to affirm a number that has already been presented to congregations, has already been presumably part of their vote process. And then we, of course, ratified not the 4.5% number, we ratified the new funding formula by itself. So this lists the calculation. Again, it's the total revenues raised. Again, this whole effort was aimed, or one of the principles was to try to be as responsive as possible to smaller, more rural congregations that might be most dependent on direct donations as opposed to things like rental income and other sources of revenue. It also, oh, sorry, I apologize. Again, the revenue formula that is described here, but it basically describes revenues as being, we take out outward monies, as I just described, refugee sponsorships, mission and service, all United Church appeals, all local, whether it's a food bank initiative or whatever it might be. We take out bequests because we thought that we don't want unintended consequence. It might be a disincentive if the local church wasn't getting every dollar of a bequest. Similarly, on asset sales, there are other mechanisms to deal with that. Okay, so I'm being encouraged to stop there. The other part of the formula that was in the Remit background materials was provision for a transition period. And specifically, we told folks that instead of jacking up assessments right away, that we needed to live into this model. So there was provision for a 10% cap, which would actually apply for the first few years. We take what you were paying in 2018, and there'd be a 10% increase on that, but that would probably be the number you'd be looking at for the next few years. Again, you're being asked to affirm that part. That's in section 1A. And 1B describes the way that a cap would work. Now, as a practical matter, probably 75 to 80% of pastoral charges are looking at increases in excess of the 10%. I know of several. I know in my own congregation, which is a relatively strong urban congregation, we voted in favor of this even though our assessment would more than double. Their premise was that we needed to step up. They bought the argument that congregations with more capacity could and should potentially pay more. So that's 1A and 1B. That describes the formula. It affirms what we've told folks. Okay, part 2 is that the General Council be the one to authorize any changes to the rate. So we're having to move into this rate anyway. Most congregations are going to select the 10% cap. One of the messages that I've been trying to deliver is we're all in the same boat now, where we are managing, unfortunately, an environment where total revenue is gradually reducing. It's not precipitous, but we aren't in a growth environment, so we are going to be managing financial constraint. So you're being asked. So I personally believe that increasing the rate, I honestly don't foresee any time in the future.
To argue for it, and just to present it.
Oh, okay, sorry. So in any case, it says that authorize any changes to the assessment rate, which arguably could be an increase or a decrease. How am I doing? Is that better? Okay, okay. So the principles and assumptions that are in the preamble have been previously approved by the General Council Executive over the last 6 months or so. And they, in turn, have produced an initial budget outlook for 2019, which is in the Remit implementation material. But here today, if I was to summarize, you're being asked to affirm the rate that was in the Remit materials to begin with, which was 4.5%. And then you're being asked to affirm that it is, in fact, the General Council that would need to discuss and vote on any changes to that in the future.
And in the workbook, there were 5 proposals. There's now the 6th because during the consent, we had GC43 Remit-related revisions to the basis of union pulled, and so it's part of our conversation, and I'm asking Fred to speak to that.
Merci, Graham. En effet, il s'agit de les bases de l'union, les principes de l'union. This is all about the basis of union, and I'll speak to the microphone, even in English. The basis of union is not an historic document. It is a living charter of the United Church of Canada. It is our basic constitution. In 1925 and the years before that, the negotiating churches concluded between themselves, and it took a long time, the actual basis on which they would work together. They recite in the preamble to the basis of union that they made compromises. They selected a little bit of this from the Methodists, a little bit of that from the Presbyterians, a little bit of that from the Brethrens, put it together, prayed a lot, came to an agreement, and called it the basis of union. Over the last 93 years, it has been changed, but only to the Remit basis, and the changes were relatively slight. Some changes, but relatively slight. In the comprehensive review process, God was speaking to the church in new ways. In the 42nd General Council, when it enacted the provisions that went to Remit, worked hard and long on establishing a new basis for the polity sections and for certain other parts of the basis of union. In the remits that were sent out to the church, all of the remits ended with the words, "and the basis of union be amended in these ways." The job of the Manual Committee of the United Church of Canada, of which I'm a member, as reviewed by the General Council Executive, was to propose to you a basis of union amended accordingly. And this job is fairly, very technical. It was involving putting the remits into words of the basis of union. In many cases, it was copier-coller, it was cut and paste. In other ways, it was to stitch a little bit. But we are bound, absolutely, the church is bound, and the Manual Committee and the General Council Executive were bound to present to you a version of the basis of union that was entirely faithful with the wording that had been approved by the church as a whole. So the document you have before you are the polity sections of the basis of union, because they're the ones amended by the Remit. Sections 1 and 2, which is the reason why we exist, and 2, which is the doctrine section, and certain other sections at the end are not changed by this. So it's the middle section of the basis of union, a very important section. What will happen with that document, the amended basis of union, if you pass it, we will have to seek an amendment to the United Church of Canada Act, the federal statute, which has been ratified by the provinces and other jurisdictions, to have this written into our Constitution. But when we go to the Parliament of Canada, we have to demonstrate that the version of the basis of union that they're presenting to them for enactment is faithful to the remits that you passed. Anyway, that's a summary of it. And I admit at times the Manual Committee and the General Council Executive were probably tempted to fix up the wording that perhaps in a quick moment in Corner Brook were inelegantly expressed, but they were expressed, and they were the view of the church, and they have been approved by the church. So our task as humble servants of the church is to faithfully translate those into the wording of the basis of union. Thank you.
So you've heard an overview of these 6 proposals, and now the question for you is, what questions for clarification, what things are not clear, do you need to be made clear now, so that when you go to your discussion sessions later, you can help other people hear those if they might have those questions for clarity as well. And as if you've been in one of my listening sessions before, there will be times I'm going to say, that's a really great question, but it's not for clarification, and that's a really good one for your discussion group later. So I'm going to say that before we begin. There isn't anyone taking notes in the listening session. When you get to your discussion session, as you've noticed, there's someone that's taking notes and feeding that back to the facilitation team. This is a place for you to get that clarity so that you can help others in your discussion session later answer those, because they're at other listening sessions right now, and hopefully we'll be able to help you with that as well. So, questions for clarity or for clarification or for, yes. And Ashley's gonna run around and help us be heard.
Just a quick question, Graham. Could you remind us why CG08 was pulled from the consent agenda?
It's a great question. Daniel was the one that requested it to be pulled. And so do you want to answer that question? Oh, Ashley, do you want to bring the mic over to Daniel? He'll answer that question for us.
Daniel McDonald, Bay of Quinte. Part of the reason that, I proposed lifting it out of the consent was because I felt, and in some of the other conversations that I had with folks, there was a feeling that some of the, recognizing that we were pretty limited given the remit language and kind of wanting to remain faithful to the remits, we also wanted to recognize that there are theological and missional kind of underpinnings to the document of the Basis of Union, and we want to be as faithful to those as we can while still honoring the language of the remits. And I think given the significance of those changes and given the significance of the document, it was felt that having that discussion time before the vote would be more helpful than just grouping it in a consent docket and kind of pushing it through that way.
Great, thank you. I don't know where you were going before I called you away.
Lloyd Bruce, Maritime Conference. My question's in regards to GCE 19. And this proposal sees the denomination at its annual gathering or its triennial gathering setting the assessment rate. Is there any plan to have the denominational gathering consider the split of the assessment as being spent between the denominational office and the regions? Because if one looks at the numbers, presently approximately 47% of assessed funds go to support the denominational office and the balance goes to the regions. And that's a concern for me.
So Eric might have a different answer, and if I say something wrong, you just start running. This is to implement the remit material itself. The policy and procedure around how that is split is another conversation that isn't actually part of the assessment. The assessment itself is one thing. The division of how that money is distributed between the church is another. Is that about right? Technically, yeah. Okay.
When two Hawaiian shirts meet.
I'm actually wearing this shirt as a tribute to Ross because we sat at the same table in 2015. The whole budget process and the split is absolutely something that is going to need to be considered on an ongoing basis. This first round really, could I ask people to call me out of order if you want? How many people have seen the pie chart reporting that the General Counsel Office issues and has been issuing for the last 5 or 6 years? I'm hoping it's everyone or most of you, and it is, so that's good. The starting point for this current round of allocation was really based on, as I said, on the remit failing. It was based on the logic that what would, from the General Council's budget point of view, phasing out conference operating grants as part of moving to this definition of mission versus governance and shared service. So this will be a subject of continuing review and will need to be, because as long as we're in that declining revenue environment, we're going to have to look at all those priorities that we love so much. The $5 million a year that is allocated resource to our global work, or the similar amount that is allocated to our Aboriginal and right relations. So that will be an ongoing piece of work. But this first round of budget and budget outlook was developed based on the principles that are in the preamble to the document.
Thanks. So we'll go here, and then I know there's a couple hands over here. We'll get to Mead and Kathy.
So Graham, I want to follow up on your response to Lloyd's question about how the split is not addressed in this particular proposal. I want to know where we as a general council can get at this meeting, in part because, and the reason for my question is that if you take the amount of money allocated to the regions, which is allocated prior to the decision about the number of regions, the amount of money available to each region declines by $200,000, which is making it very difficult. I mean, I speak as the secretary of a regional committee, so I want to know where we get at the question of the split.
Sure, the answer to that is that during your discussion session, you raise that, and you can talk to, it goes to the facilitation team, they will see that in your notes.
Okay.
You can also bring new business to the business table.
Okay, so it's not, but it's not in the agenda as it's currently formulated.
As far as I've seen,
Okay.
It's not. So
Thank
if
you.
it's new business that you want, the business table does receive new business and see if it fits into the agenda.
Mead Baldwin, Montreal Ottawa Conference. It's about GC19. Part of the idea when I was talking to my congregation and locally and everything was that this would drastically change mission and service, that the mission and service funding would totally go toward mission projects, etc. And I haven't seen a whole lot about that, and I think that should be promoted, and I think that would help sell the assessment going up if we saw something more about how this would enhance the work of mission and service. So I just want some clarity. Is there any space anywhere where that comes out?
In the stuff that, other than the reports, and David Armour is with us, he could tell you, you could talk to him and get more of that information. Again, if that's stuff you're looking for, I think all of the work that's been done to this point, the assessment itself is about the shared services and governance piece. The mission service stuff has been communicated in a different way, and it's not something we're making a decision about, other than we made the decision in the remits to do that in Remit 4. So that's the only place that it really is working in any of our proposals is Remit 4, which we enacted on Sunday. And so all of the rest of the information about how the Mission Service Fund is continuing is out there, and David will be happy to sign you up for PAR.
Kathy Hamilton, Synode Montréal et Ottawa, and my question is also about GCE08, which was removed from the consent motion. I'm wondering if I can have some direction about any specific language that we should be looking at. It's a 15-page document, and I wonder if there are particular things, or if the desire is just to have a general conversation about the document.
Daniel, was it general or was it specific? Great. Do you want to just come up here? There are a couple of specifics, so let's hear them. Wait till you get to the mic.
Yeah, so I'll just give a brief overview of some of the comments that I noted around that. If I can find my pages here. There was significant discussion from some folks about the fact that there was language removed about the pastoral charge being the primary organizational unit of the church. So that's how the current basis of union is structured. But in the revisions, that language of it being the primary organizational unit was taken out. So there were some concerns about that being a significant change to our ecclesiology as to kind of the thrust of where the power of our church rests. So that was one. If you want a specific number, if you look at 5.3.3, I don't have a page number, but 5.3.3 of the revisions, the current basis of union has a section in there about care for the sick and care for the elderly, and the revisions seem to focus more on the youth and young adult demographic. Not that that isn't important, but some of that sick and elderly language also got kind of revised and perhaps edited out. And there are a couple places, again, as Fred kind of mentioned when he gave an overview, recognizing that in Corner Brook, some of the language of the remit might have been, a little bit clunky at the time of the remit, that does pose certain limitations. But there were a couple sections around kind of 5.3 and 6.3 where the language of Jesus Christ was shortened simply to Jesus. And there are theological differences between the person of Jesus and the Christ language. So again, there's some kind of theological considerations there. And the one final section I'll bring up, because I don't want to be out here forever, is a little bit around, let's see if I can find a number here. 5.2 thereabouts, I think, talking about some of the distinctions between, or the value, I guess the distinctions between members and adherents. And it seems like some of those lines might have been blurred. And again, I recognize that there were limitations around the membership remit, and perhaps that was the reason there, but I think it's, again, significant enough that it should be lifted up and just considered before that final vote takes place.
Thank you. Ashley's on her way.
Daniel, I have to admit my ignorance there. Could you repeat what you said about pastoral charges and the implications for pastoral charges?
The original language that the pastoral charges were the primary mission unit of the church.
Mission unit.
Organizational unit.
Oh, that's different.
Of the church, and that is no longer in these words.
Oh, I don't like that.
Thank you. Is it Dave Clark from Manitou Conference? It is on...
Closer. Hold it just a little bit closer.
Closer? Yes. Okay. Dave Clark from Manitou Conference, and it's a question on GC19. So just for clarification on the 4.5%, I have two questions. One is, and maybe I should know this, Eric, but right now we have two fees, the presbytery fees and conference fees. Like the church, money that goes from the churches for presbytery fees and money that goes to conference fees. So when we say it's 4.5% and the cap is 10% of what you paid previously, is it 10% of the combination or is it 10% of the conference fees? That's one question. And then the second question was, it was an interesting stat that you gave us that the more than 85% of the churches will have higher fees. I didn't realize there was that much. But so then what percentage, do you know, maybe you don't know, it's just a curiosity for the conference's sake, what percent would be impacted by the 10%? It'd be a lesser number, I assume.
So the first question, and Eric, you can make your way on up to finish the conversation. I don't know about all conferences, but I know most congregations pay presbytery fees, and it's the presbytery that pay an assessment to the conference. Is that the same in most conferences? I didn't know that there were congregations that had assessments directly to their conferences. So,
Do you want me to
go ahead, Eric.
take it? The amount the assessment that was approved by Remit replaces the combination. Basically, it's what pastoral charges pay that is subject to the 10%. There are places in the country where people would get an itemized bill saying this is the conference portion and this is the presbytery portion. There are places where they don't get that information, but this particular aspect focuses on the amount billed to the pastoral charge, which is basically the full assessment. And that is, so what pastoral charges are paying is what's subject to the 10% cap. And in terms of the percentage, it varies across the country, but it also reflects the way the church grew. So in Ontario and East, most pastoral charges are looking at increases, and out west it's a little more uneven because there's a tradition there of having assessed more.
Thanks.
Catherine Stewart, Maritime Conference. I'm looking at GC8, again, with remit-related revisions to the basis of union. Specifically, I'm looking for clarification around language when it comes to talking about the church and communities of faith. So sections 4.1 and 4.2. In the church section, it talks about that the members of pastoral charges and congregations shall continue to be members of the United Church. But then in section 3, talking about communities of faith, there's no mention of pastoral charges and congregations. So I guess I'm looking for clarification around the use of language in this particular proposal, because it's confusing.
Thank you for the question. It's a question of transition. What we were doing is reassuring folk that all existing members remain members of the church. The next section in communities of faith talks about members of the church belonging to them. Communities of faith are a grouping of members. Members are the ones that were members on December 31st, 2018. It's a transition measure, and future ones. It was just to get us through the transition. Okay.
Sorry, I have the same question. The question is the use of language of congregation and pastoral charge in some places and communities of faith elsewhere. And it shows up in other documents. For example, communities of faith will elect one representative to the regional council, but in the webinar we were told one person per 100, but in the webinar we were told that the selections will be done as they are being done now, which means that in a multi-point charge, a 3-point charge, they end up with 3 lay representatives, but it's very confusing if the congregation is a community of faith and the pastoral charge is a community of faith, to know what it is that we're talking about. And that, I think, is Catherine's question, that we're using the same word for what has traditionally been known as 2 separate bodies.
Great. Cynthia is going to weigh in.
And I think one of the reasons we're using that term in 2 different ways is because of the definition of community of faith that was set by the 42nd General Council. Community of faith is a broad umbrella term that can include all kinds of things, and there are some specific examples given in the motion that was adopted by GC43 and also in the remit. 2 of those examples given are congregations and pastoral charges. So I can understand the confusion, because how can they both be when there are perhaps certain responsibilities and rights attached to a community of faith. Which is it in the context? Our thinking is that's something that's going to be worked out between the regional council and the community of faith, whatever will be recognized in the covenantal relationship between them as the community of faith for the purposes of electing representatives to the regional council. The regional councils are going to have a lot of discretion working with communities of faith and setting up the covenant and how they will function together in relationship, and that will be something that will be left to them to work out in mutual agreement. Mm-hmm.
So then, if I'm a member of a community of faith, am I a member of a congregation or a member of a pastoral church? Where does my membership lie?
I would say your membership lies in the pastoral charge or congregation, because that is the kind of community of faith that you are.
Yes, but not all members of my congregation are like, congregational membership doesn't transfer into the pastoral.
No. So for that purpose, you would be a member of the congregation if the regional council agrees in its covenantal relationship, if you're talking about that for the purpose of deciding how many members you're going to elect to the regional council. Yep.
Okay. Well, if by the end of the conversation we're still not clear, let's come back to it, though. Okay. If there's some other stuff, so.
Barry Reader from Toronto Conference. I'm just needing some clarification in regards to the 4.5% assessment that General Council is going to end up have. Then in addition to that, regions could determine what their assessment would be. So
That's
that would be on
correct.
top of it. But there are some denominational funds or funds from General Council that would be available as well. Out of the 4.5 assessment. So there's some funds coming that to deploy to the region for staffing.
Right.
But if there was program staff that the region wanted, it would be up to them to decide what that assessment would be.
Yes, regions can assess above the 4.5 for their own budgeting processes as they so desire.
Right. Thank you.
Eric has something more to say to that.
The Remit and the comprehensive review and the work of General Council 42 did provide for regions to be able to assess extra. I did want to clarify, though, that the definitions that we've been using are the idea of having separate funding for mission and ministry, which would come from mission and service giving, versus assessment, which would come from or which would cover governance and shared services. So in your example, for program staff, I think we're trying to fund that out of the M&S portions that people have. I just wanted to make that distinction. And I also wanted to take the opportunity, I don't typically check my email while I'm in a session like this, but I do have an email and regrets from Brian Cornelius, who was taken ill after lunch and is back in his room for the moment. So that explains why he's not here today.
Hi, Graham. Steve Barabay, Maritime Conference, and I haven't been at a microphone today.
Can't say that anymore.
I know. My question is about clusters and networks and some of what has led to this point and to the proposal we have before us. Quite simply, has there been any consultation with the members of clusters or networks by the General Council before the decisions came from the General Council in the November meeting?
David Allen, would you have an answer to that question?
I don't have a good answer, but I'll give you what I can. We're well aware that for a lot of people, clusters and networks are going to be really important and are perceived to be important. What we also recognize is that they're, at the moment, kind of hard to pin down because in most cases they're organic. So in some cases there are existing networks, and I'm aware of that, and there are clusters that are starting to be developed across the church. But in terms of what the General Council executive was doing, was trying to be clear that there would be no predetermination about what those would be, because they will emerge in both cases of clusters and networks. So what we're hoping to do is to, in the fall, start putting out requests for people to tell their stories about clusters or networks that have worked and ones that haven't worked. So we haven't done, we don't have a comprehensive list of all the networks and certainly not of all the clusters. So in terms of consultation around that, there has been some, of which you've been part, but not very much.
I'm not sure if there's been some. I can't really recall being asked any questions chairing one of the major social justice networks in this denomination. And I know I'm getting into a bit of debate, but he opened the door, Graham, so just give me 1 minute in terms of this. In terms of that, I would trust that we as a denomination recognize that there are things we know that we know. There are things we know that we don't know, and I'm beginning to sound like Donald Rumsfeld. But for me, in terms of the General Council executive and how this proposal has come forward, it's really key to keep lines of communication open.
Thank you. And I trust that that will be recorded in notes this afternoon.
So Bill Thomas, Hamilton Conference. My question is around, so in, let's see, what am I at? The assessment document, it talks specifically about the assessment towards pastoral charges. But we're moving from pastoral charges to communities of faith. And I'm wondering, what about, like, how does this affect like house churches, because that's named, or any of the other ministries that are happening within a region? Are they also assessed as a community of faith, or is this specific? Is it specific to pastoral charges, and how is that determined?
That's a fantastic question for someone else to answer.
There has been much conversation about that, whether it's over breaks here or all over the place, frankly. I have heard a number of people suggest from all levels of the church, for example, that there might be an assessment paid by community ministries. Now, I've spent my whole adult life working with community ministries, and the mission and service money we give them is the core glue that holds them together already. It's the core funding. I personally don't believe there's much option there unless we get into a almost nominal type fee. But right now is a time where we have to be open to all kinds of different ideas. Right now, the financial model is based still on our existing notion of congregations, where we don't necessarily assess a mission unit that we're trying to build, and certainly not an outreach ministry. I hope that answers your question.
So the question being, as new definitions of what communities of faith are coming to be, how do we ensure that we know what sort of funding might be available for them? And I think what we heard earlier too is that in the covenantal relationship between the region and a new community of faith, or whatever that community of faith is being described as, one of those things in the covenantal relationship is going to need to be, is there a funding assessment that's set that they're paying into? So I don't know if that fully answers the question, because I don't think there is a full answer to that question. So,
Brownman Harmon, Bay of Quinte Conference. I have a question, and it's from GCE 8, around membership of regional councils. And I heard Cynthia saying that the council itself is going to have some discretion around many things. However, as a member of the Transition Committee for Region 12, we're trying to plan the first annual meeting. So we need some way of understanding how many people might gather. And I was reading 6.23, lay members elected by the community of faith, respecting the balance of lay and ministry personnel where possible. Is that some direction there? But I don't totally understand what it means. So I was hoping that while we were here together, we could come up with, we could either say, like the webinar, well, for now it's the way we've always done it, or we could come up with something else that is really clear for the first round. And then sure, we can change it after that. So I'm just kind of asking for, I think, some useful direction.
yeah, and I think personally, I would say in your discussion group, make sure that goes. The facilitation team will take that, hear it from the discussion groups, and try to offer us a way forward. But I think that if you're really clear in the same way that you just were about what your expectation is or your hope is for the end of this week, we will work as a council together to get there.
Good. Did you have something, or were you waving at me? No, okay.
We'll come back over this way in a second.
Lloyd Bruce, Maritime Conference. I have two questions, if I may. The first question, I've heard the phrase again, covenantal relationship between the community of faith and the region. Is it expected that the denomination will provide a framework for that covenantal relationship so that there is a standard covenantal relationship across this United Church of Canada of ours? Or will we experience and see regional diversity across the land? That's the first question.
David? Is this, okay, this mic's back on.
I'm not sure of the number of the proposal, but there is another one before you, and was it included in consent yesterday? Sorry, I just have to double check. But it clarified that for the start of the new structure, that whatever governance arrangements are in place now in a pastoral charge, congregation, or other kind of community of faith, they will continue. They will be the covenant with the regional council until and unless they are changed with the mutual agreement of the regional council and the community of faith. So starting out, that will be the covenant. GS05.
So that's one part of it. So that's where we are now. And in terms of going forward, there was a template covenant that had been developed by the Comprehensive Review Task Group. What we'll do is that we'll be taking a look at that and probably providing an updated template that could be offered to the 16 regional councils. But what will happen is that although there'll be a template, every covenant may be somewhat different than the others because of the conversation that goes on between the community of faith and the regional council.
Does that answer your first question? So the answer is there is an outline, but it's not the same across the country. And it won't be the same within the regions.
Did you have another
Yeah.
question?
Second question,
Did you have another
unless you're ceding the mic.
Do you have another question?
If I may. Again, needing to ask a question of the background information so that I can make a fully informed decision on the proposal GC19. In the background information to the proposal, there is indication in every one of the last 4 paragraphs that is making reference to one of 16 regions. Can someone help me understand at what point and how a decision was made to move towards less than a regional minister for each region, and instead have a cluster, a regional minister serving a cluster, and how that decision was made? Because that impacts how those assessment dollars are spent, and it comes from one pocket to go into another.
Yeah, please.
So you're asking specifically about the role of the executive minister, is that correct? I just want to be sure that we're on the same page here.
So what I'm asking, David, is that in the last 4 paragraphs of the background information, it speaks very clearly of dividing the resources 1/16. And at some point a decision was made to have a set of provisional regional ministers serving a cluster of region rather than funding one regional minister per region. When was that decision made? How is it made? And what was the basis for making that decision?
Sure. Okay, thanks. So what happened, the most important piece of information that we needed to answer a bunch of other questions, especially around staffing, was how many regions are there going to be? So we had to wait for the interim report of the Boundaries Commission. So they came in and had one number, and eventually, as we know, by the end of February, it turned into that there would be 16 regional councils. Almost concurrent with that, the Remit Implementation Task Group was working on staffing models because that was one of the major questions that had been coming up over and over again. So what we did was that we came up with 3 different staffing models, and we put those out to the conferences and said, what do you think of these 3 models? And we asked for feedback on a very tight timeline. And we got the feedback that essentially the church didn't like any of the 3. Not surprising. So what we did, though, was that we got really good feedback, and so we were able to develop a 4th model. And what was clear when we put out the models, that where the church seemed to be leaning, as we were hearing it, was that they wanted to have not an executive minister for every regional council, but they wanted there to be a smaller number of 5 or 6 who would serve 2 or 3 regional councils each. So that's what turned into the final model of staffing that we looked at. And then we took that to the General Council executive, and the executive affirmed that. So that's how we ended up with the staffing model around the executive ministers that we're working into right now. In terms of how the money was divided up into equal portions, there was a fair amount of conversation took place at the staff leaders, and staff leaders are the senior management at the General Council office, plus all of the executive secretaries and speaker. And over the years, the executive secretaries and speaker have really taken the lead on figuring out how to divide up the pot of money that was available for the conferences. And so the same group took a look at how much money was there to be divided up and how should that be done. So the recommendation came from that group that there would be equal portions, and then that recommendation went from the staff group to the Permanent Committee on Finance. The Permanent Committee on Finance agreed with that, passed it on to the General Council Executive. Is that pretty much accurate? Yeah. Eric is nodding yes.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Eric Lucas. I'm from Ottawa Presbytery, Montreal and Ottawa Conference. I used to think I understood systems management until I looked at the scope of all of this. So if I ask what some people think is an ignorant question, please forgive me. I want to approach this from the back end because I sit on the executive of our presbytery, and the questions about what's going to happen on the ground are flying, and I just don't know how to answer. The big one that I want to ask is about what we would call today CPMs, right? And I understand the model that we're working for one central person for 3 regions. But where there is a lot of stress, and maybe you can help me out, is once the CPMs are in place, and 1 CPM for 3 regions as we're understanding. What happens if we're in an area where churches say, no, but we need supplemental help, supplemental professional help? How, I'm not saying do we have the right or not, but what do I tell people who ask me what the process forward is, and where does the money come from? Do you understand? Like, I'm even having a hard time asking the question, but you're nodding your head, so I'll stop.
I think it's a valid question, and it's one that I think the congregations, communities of faith, are having. So thanks for raising it. And there may not be a full answer, but what I'm going to say is part of an answer that I think I know. That the Office of Vocation Ministers, who will serve 2 or 3 regions each, are not the CPMs. They take the Office of Vocation, it's a different position. They do the Office of Vocation Minister job, which is to oversee the candidacy pathway and to help the Board of Vocation with the oversight of clergy within their bounds, et cetera, and all of that sort of thing. Regions have the right to hire someone in the other role of the CPM that they've been doing, which is the pastoral oversight of clergy. But the regions aren't required to do that. And so some regions might have a person that does that job that we now know as CPM, or Conference Personnel Minister, but the Office of Vocation Minister job is a different job than what we currently know CPMs to do, but it is a portion of what they do.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question? Sure. And here's where we trip up in the discussions that I've been having. So the Office of Vocation and then the regions to hire supplemental help. We won't even give it a name. Where does the money come from to pay for that? I'm not saying, this is not a question, is there enough? It's where is it drawn out of?
Right, so the 4.5% assessment that goes to the General Council and the M&S money that goes back from those 2 things that go back through the regions, 1/16 of each of those that go back, that's the money that's used to pay for staffing. Regions have the right to also assess more above that if there are other things that they think are important within their regions to fund, like a position like you're talking about.
Sorry, I will pass it there next. This is a follow-up comment and question to Ross Bartlett's question. He hears a voice coming from behind him about the association. So, Ross, yes, you are right. I'm speaking now as chair of the Permanent Committee on Ministry of Employment Policies and Services. You are right, there has not been communication because there hasn't been anything yet that can be communicated because the association task group is working hard. I'm going to ask Adam Hanley, who is staff, to clarify the role that MEPS and GC have been given from GC42, like what we were asked to do from GC42, and also to clarify what the role of the association
was, which I think is different than the way you described it.
So at the 42nd General Council, the motion related to an association of ministers that came out of the Omnibus Comp Review motion asked the General Council executive to establish a working group to consider the idea of establishing an association of ministers. This work in this triennium was passed along to the Permanent Committee for Ministry Employment Policies and Services, and so the task group was established early in 2017 and has been working since then on the work of considering the idea. Because out of the Comprehensive Review Task Group work, they did ask the church to engage in conversation in their Fishing on the Other Side document and study about the association, but because that happened in a presbytery with comments by lay folk and ministry personnel who may be members of the association, the data from that was quite inconclusive, and so the Comprehensive Review Task Group said more work needs to be done. And so for the last year and a bit, the task group has been meeting regularly and has been wrestling with their consideration. They've consulted with professional association-like groups that exist within the United Church, like DUC and Unifaith, and associations that operate outside of the church, like the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, as well as a member of the Ontario Bar Association. And haven't really been able to communicate much because they're wrestling and trying to figure out what can be offered and what can be shared. And because it's all happening in the midst of Remit implementation, because those pieces were figured out more clearly and didn't require more consideration in this triennium, there was also a bit of conversation in the task group about, well, now we know how many regional councils there are, what would that mean for this work? Now, at each time a little bit more information was known, the task group moved a little bit and had different considerations. And Ross is correct that after the busy season in the church of Lent and Easter, the task group did invite ministry personnel to complete a survey to help them gain insight in some of the issues they were struggling with in their consideration. And as part of that, a background document was offered as staff support to that task group. As I reviewed all comments offered, narrative comments, it was very clear, even though communication was offered, some folks struggled to grasp the kind of broad understandings and ideas that the task group was sharing. But from the survey, the task group realizes that in the absence of presbytery, folks are still yearning for a collegial space. And so, so that is known. And what is currently unclear is what would the work of an association like group or being be? And then how does it fit with the regional council responsibility for support and encouragement for ministry personnel, which the Remit outlines as one of the regional council responsibilities.
Thanks.
Mary Sumpter, Maritime Conference, specifically Bermuda. I mention that because there's a reason. I've been in other meetings where the facilitator said there's no such thing as a stupid question. I hope that applies. Back to clusters and networks. My understanding is that a cluster is for people in a certain area, whereas a network is all over but people with a specific interest. Excuse me. Is it the assumption that a cluster will be within a certain region?
No, they can be cross-regional boundaries, but
Okay.
typically it's geographic.
You've answered my question. Thank you.
Good. 1 out of 30.
Sean Hancock, Maritime Conference. I thought I understood GCE 19, but in the last conversation we were having about it in terms of covenant with our pastoral charges and communities of faith, am I given to understand that if my church closed and we went down the street and we worshipped in a house and we renegotiated our covenant with our region, that we could debate whether or not we would be assessed? Because that's what it sounded like to me, that would be negotiable. For existing pastoral charges, it's not, but for new ones, it is.
David? I think I did say that, and I...
We hadn't really thought of that. But from a technical point of view, the answer is yes. Because a covenant is always between a community of faith and a regional council, but the covenant doesn't come out of thin air, it comes out of conversation. And so what would happen in the scenario that you're looking at is that your community of faith would make a proposal to the regional council about why you would be exempted from assessment, and they would say no, or they would talk about it.
This is going to make for a lot of work for our regional councils, because I think almost everyone would want to renegotiate their terms if that's the case. And there's no point in having a regional assessment in which everyone shares and which everyone takes part if it doesn't in fact apply to everyone.
And I think that will be a decision of the regional council to make a policy or whatever, however you're going to operate. Because the covenant is between communities of faith and the regional council. And as we heard, that every one of the covenants will be individualized, and every region will have a separate idea of what they want in their covenants.
This is so, but the assessment is made by the denominational council, not the regional council. Therefore, the region does not have the authority to negotiate.
If they pay a national assessment. So house church.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It is going to be, over the long term, a lot of work to have these conversations between the regional councils and the communities of faith, which is why we were, when Cynthia and I were up here a minute ago, we were talking about the fact that essentially, starting on January 1st, all the current rules and regulations are basically going to continue into the new system. So, you know, if you're paying assessment now, you're going to continue paying an assessment. It's just going to come from, the bill's going to come from a different place, and you'll send the check somewhere else. But over time, there will in fact be conversations, but it'll be the unusual circumstances where an assessment is not paid.
Okay.
So Ashley, I've seen 2 more questions. There's one right here, and there's one back in the bleachers, and we have 9 minutes left. So let's do those 2, and then we'll see if we go anywhere beyond that.
Okay, thank you again. It's Dave Clark from Manitou Conference. After, just a clarity on 19 again, after the question by my neighbor on regional fees, I just want to clarify my understanding. I thought that, somehow I thought that there could not be regional fees to a church until they had reached their 4.5%. So if they were capped, so that they didn't get paid more than the cap, that they would not get any regional fees until after they reached the cap. I just wanted to check if that's the case.
2 comments, and if I may, I'll offer a comment on just what you were talking about as well. There is no rule like that. I think the constraint will be that we will all need to make a compelling case to our communities of faith for the value they're getting out of the assessment, and in particular, any extra assessment. But having said that, there is not, logically, like if you were looking at it outside of a church context, one would want to get to the revenue, the overall core shared revenue, which is what we're talking about, first before there was extra levies. But the General Council 42 directive was not that specific, and we feel that it would be inappropriate to jump to even a logical conclusion. So I'm sorry, I introduced just a bit of judgment in there.
We're all getting a little punchy.
Cheryl Wood Thomas, Hamilton Conference, and I had a question of clarification about the MAR 03, about the Association of Ministers. I understand from what you just said that you're looking into whether ministers need an association for collegiality. I thought the point of it was we need an association for advocacy. Is that not part of that?
Adam might have something else to say, but I don't think that was ever in the mandate.
Yeah, so the mandate was a broad consideration of the idea, and that is what the task group has been broadly looking at considering, and in their work has engaged in some conversation about advocacy. And so that is a piece of the work.
Is that an important piece of the work? Because I've got collegial friends. I need someone to speak for me when I can't speak.
So that'll be part of your discussion session this afternoon. The question I think you're asking was that considered? The answer is that it's being considered. Your conversation will be, that's an important piece that needs to be in this. Is that?
Sure.
Thanks. I saw one more hand back over here before when I said that we were taking two more, and then we still have some time. And you've gone. Oh, back up here, sure. Oh, the mic's coming.
Barry Reeder from Toronto Conference. I think there needs to be some clarification around the 10%, because I think I'm hearing from my neighbor here, Dave. He's thinking that the total assessment could be up to 10% of the pastoral charge. My understanding is that that 10% in this proposal here is that out of that 4.5%, let's say a congregation right now is only paying 2%. So what would happen is that there could be an increase of 10% of that other 2.5%, so like 0.2% minimum that would have. But the assessment here is not going to be more than 4.5 from the denomination. It's not talking about, the 10% has nothing to do with what could happen from the region. So I think it needs to be clarified. I have a different understanding than I think Dave does.
So if I may, I'll just use a numeric example. If your pastoral charge is paying an assessment of $1,000, just to keep it nice and round, for 2018, and your calculated assessment based on your revenues is $2,000, is double. Let's pick a more extreme example. You can elect, we're trying to have a provision for transition. You must, quote unquote, pay the 1,100, so 10% increase on the 1,000 that you're already paying. Some congregations, including my own, are saying, wow, if our thing's going to double, we may want to phase that in, as opposed to be looking at huge jumps. So my congregation might elect to pay $1,200 or $1,300 as part of getting to the ultimate goal, and as part of participating fully in the sharing model that we're talking about. But the number, if your revenue is 1,000, or if your assessment is 1,000, 2019, your first choice, which will be the choice of many because of how challenged and pinched our congregations are, your first choice will be an $1,100 assessment.
Is that incremental? So the year after to be 10% and 1,100 and so on?
Right now, the cap has been, we have to grow into this in all kinds of different ways. So the cap has actually been suggested for 3 years. So 2019, 1,100, 2020, 1,100, 2021, 1,100, and then the question is, for the next General Council, how fast can we get to the 4.5% target?
It's break time before going to our discussion sessions this afternoon. So before we do that, just a thank you to all of you for your questions, for your listening, for your discernment. Thank you to all of those who presented and answered questions. A thank you to just being open to this format and to this. You're welcome. So as you leave from this place, go knowing that you're going with the blessing of God that is in the midst of all of the work. Go in the knowing that you are blessed by the one who has called you to be here. Go knowing the blessing of the one who even in silence, has been with us. Go knowing the blessing of God. Amen.